everybody. It's good to see you this morning. You know, there's tucked way back in the Old Testament, there's this great little book in there. It's the book of Esther. And I think in the book of Esther, there are some great nuggets of truth that we can take and just apply to our lives. And so in the next few minutes, we're going to take just a little survey of the entire book of Esther. Heard the story about the passengers on a cruise ship who were just having the best time of their lives when suddenly one of the passengers, who was just a beautiful young woman, fell overboard. And in this great act of bravery, a man goes over the side and rescues this young lady. Well, the crew of the ocean liner pulls them both out of the dangerous waters, back up into the boat into safety, and when they got them back on board, the captain of the ship was just so surprised to find that the man who rescued this beautiful young lady was 80 years old. 80 years old. And the captain was just astounded, so he made special arrangements to honor the man that night at dinner. And he had the guy sit at the captain's table, and he had an award made up to present to this elderly hero. And at the presentation, the man was asked just if he wanted to say a few words. And so he got up and he said, folks, I really appreciate your thoughtfulness. And he said, but the first thing I'd like to do this evening is to simply find out who pushed me. You know, I think all of us at one time or another might dream a little of doing something big or heroic. We want to do the right thing, to make a difference, even if it's not always appreciated like it should be, or is not the easiest thing to do. The story of Esther is a story about how one person made a difference between life and death for a whole lot of people. Esther, you see, was this orphan Jewish girl who, because of her beauty and grace and a rather odd chain of events, became queen of Persia, which is now Iran. And because of the prejudice of one man, Haman, the entire Jewish nation was on the brink of extinction. And the bottom line was that Haman had it in for him, and he would stop nothing to make it happen. And so Esther's cousin, Mordecai, begs her to do something. Now, if her Jewish family, the Jewish nation, has any hope of surviving this threat from Haman, Esther needs to make a decision. And like so many situations, I think, in which we can find ourselves, Esther's compelled to do something, but realizes that she is powerless to do it all on her own. In the life of Queen Esther, we see very, very early in the story that God put people in her life who helped show her love and kindness. In fact, in chapter 2 and verse 7, the Bible says that when her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her into his family and raised her as his own daughter. And later, when Esther moved into the palace as a candidate for the queen, she found favor in the eyes of this guy named Haggai. Haggai was in charge of making all the arrangements for the candidates and who were looking to be queen. And finally, Esther's chosen queen. And even though Esther had some pretty rough times in her life, she was surrounded by people who were in her corner. And the takeaway that I see from that is, you know what? Hey, we all need somebody to support us, who will stand beside us, stand shoulder to shoulder with us, and help us, especially when we need it. You know, when the builders of a proposed bridge across Niagara Falls began construction many years ago, one of the first questions that they had to answer was, how do we get the suspension cables across this river? And somebody had the idea of launching a kite across the span with a thin line attached to it. And then using the string, they drew a rope across, which was followed by a larger rope, which was followed by a small cable, and then finally a heavy cable, strong enough to support the bridge. And when it was completed, this huge structure that could support the weight of a train showed no signs at all of having once been launched by a simple kite. The principle is this: nobody's a success on their own. Behind every successful person, behind each one of us, there's a host of people who have helped us somewhere, somehow, along the way. Something else I noticed about Esther was that she had this very humble, very teachable spirit within her. Chapter 2 and verse 10 says, Esther had not told anyone of her nationality and family background because Mordecai had directed her not to do so. She was teachable. Verse 15, she took notice of the advice of Haggai about how to approach the king when it came to be her turn. She was teachable. Verse 20 says Esther still lived by her cousin Mordecai's advice, even after she no longer was living at his home. She had this endearing, teachable character that just attracted people to her. And let's face it, nobody likes a know-it-all, even when they do know it all, right? Esther was just the opposite. She was very humble. The New Testament reminds us in the book of Colossians, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe ourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience. Humility means having the correct estimate of ourselves. Humility. Corrie ten Boom was once asked if it was ever difficult for her to remain humble with all the fame and the notoriety that she had gained in surviving the Holocaust and helping people resist the Nazis, and her reply, I think, was pretty simple. She said, when Jesus rode into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday on the back of a donkey, and everyone was waving palm branches and throwing garments onto the road and singing praises, do you think that for one moment it ever entered the head of that donkey that any of that was for him? And then she continued, hey, if I can be that donkey on which Jesus Christ rides in his glory, I give him all the praise and all the honor. Esther 2:22 says, Mordecai heard about the plot to kill the king, and he gave the information to Queen Esther. She then told the king about it and gave Mordecai credit for the report. It tells me that Esther wasn't selfish. She gave credit where credit was due. She didn't seek the limelight or try and steal the show. She remembered where she came from. Very humble. She was able to stay grounded, even though she was becoming very famous. And later on, then, when Mordecai was in mourning because he learned of the plot to actually kill the Jewish nation, she was concerned enough to offer some help. She made herself available. Two Princeton University psychologists, John Darley and Daniel Batson, decided to conduct a study some years ago that was inspired by the story of the Good Samaritan. And they conducted the study at Princeton Theological Seminary, and they met with a group of the seminarians there and asked each one of them to prepare a short talk on a given theme. And they would walk individually to a nearby building then to present it when it was their turn. And along the way to the presentation, each student would run into a man who was planted there in the alley between the buildings. And he would just be lying there moaning and groaning and pretending to be in obvious pain. And the question that they were studying was, who would stop to help the man? And Darley and Batson asked half the seminarians to give their talk on ministry opportunities available for students after graduation. And then the other half, they asked to prepare just a short devotional on the story of the Good Samaritan. They wanted to find out one other thing, too, in their research. They wanted to find out if being in a hurry made any difference to the students. And so they told a third of the group that they had plenty of time to get to the building to give their talk so they could just take their time on their way there. Another third, they told that they would make it just in time if they left right now. And then the last third of the group, they told them that they were already late, so they needed to get moving. So which ones do you think offered to help? Turns out that it made no significant difference whether the student was giving a talk on job opportunities, ministry opportunities, or the Good Samaritan. What made a difference was how much of them were in a hurry. Of the low hurry subjects, 63% of them offered help. Of the intermediate hurry subjects, 45% offered help. Now, the students who were the most in hurry, only 10% offered help. And they concluded that the study would seem to indicate that apathy is encouraged not only by the crowding of our world today, but also the rush of big city life as contrasted with the more leisurely pace of small towns. If we want to make a difference, like Esther did, part of living a life of significance is to simply take advantage of the opportunities that come our way. Something else I noticed that Esther did, she included God in what she did. And although God isn't specifically mentioned in the book of Esther, spiritual dimensions are woven all through them, those chapters. Chapter 4, verse 15 says this: Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: Go and gather all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it's against the law, I will go in to see the king, and if I must die, then I must die. She didn't rush into action at all, did she? She remembered to seek God's direction before undertaking something big. It's a great principle. And at the end of verse 16, she says, if I die, then I die. She took a huge risk to save her people. She was about to go into the presence of the king without first being asked, which meant certain death. Back then, you just couldn't walk in unannounced on the king. The law said unless he offered his grace to you, you were dead if you showed up uninvited. And Esther takes this tremendous risk. And not only does she risk something, but she sacrificed something for the greater good. Isn't it true that anything of worth always requires some kind of sacrifice? I read that of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, few were alone to survive. 5 were captured by British troops and tortured before they died. 12 had their homes looted or occupied by the enemy or burned. 2 of them lost their sons in the army. 1 had 2 sons captured. 9 of the 56 died in the war from either its hardships or from its bullets. Most of them were men who had wealth, status, and power. They could have lived in relative luxury, but they learned very quickly that liberty is so much more important than security. And so they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, and they sacrificed. And just like our forefathers in our country had a strategy to launch this nation, Esther, too, had a strategy to accomplish the task that was ahead of her. She used wisdom. She used planning, and it didn't rush into this emotional frenzy, even though so much was at stake. She said to the king, "This is my request and my deepest wish. If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request and do what I ask." She said, "Please come with Haman tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for you. And then I will explain what this is all about in chapter 5. And so here's what she did. She didn't accuse Haman directly at dinner, knowing that he was a close personal friend of the king. But she first told the king about the danger to her life and the lives of her people. And only after the king demanded in anger as to who was responsible for this did she tell him it was Haman all along. And eventually, Haman's put to death for what he did. She had a pretty good plan. And the principle is that anything worthwhile should be thought out if it's going to work. The last thing I noticed about Esther was her attitude of service. She simply put others above herself. She said, if it pleases the king, and if I have found favor with you, and if you think it's right, and if I am pleasing to the king, then let there be a decree that reverses the orders of Haman, who ordered that Jews throughout all the king's provinces should be destroyed. Esther, you see, used her position and her influence to help people instead of just enjoying her wealth and security and then just fading away into eternity. And I see so much of that that's rooted in the character of Christ. One time a religion professor, Dr. Christensen was his name, taught a survey of Christianity that was a required course at a small college. And every freshman was required to take the course regardless of his or her major. And although he tried hard to communicate the essence of the gospel to the students just viewed the class as nothing more than a waste of time, something that they just had to do. In one particular year, Dr. Christensen had this student named Steve, and Steve played center on the football team, and he also happened to be a Christian who intended to go to seminary after he graduated. And one day, Dr. Christensen gets this idea for his class, and he asked Steve to stay by after class afterwards, and he wanted to run it by him. And he asked Steve, he said, Steve, how many push-ups can you do? Steve said, I do about 200 every night. And the professor asked Steve if he thought he could do 300. And Steve said, well, I've never really done 300 before, but I think I could do it. Good, good, the professor said. He unveiled the rest of his idea to Steve. And Friday finally came, and Steve got to class early, and Dr. Christensen came into class with boxes of Krispy Kreme donuts. I wish I had this class. The class was excited. It was Friday, the last day of the week, and they just couldn't wait to start the week. And as everyone kind of settled down, Dr. Christensen went to the first girl there seated in the first row, and he said, Cindy, would you like a donut? Oh, yeah, that'd be great, she said. And Dr. Christensen very quickly turned to Steve, and he said, Steve, would you do 10 push-ups so that Cindy can have a donut? Sure. And Steve hits the floor and counts off 10 push-ups right away. Dr. Christensen lays the donut on Cindy's desk. Joe was seated beside Cindy, and he was next, and he asked Joe the same question. And Joe would love a donut, and turned to Steve and said, Steve, will you please do 10 more push-ups so that Joe can have a donut? Steve does 10 push-ups. Joe gets the donut on his desk. And so it went all the way down the row, halfway down the second row, until it came to Scott. Scott was the basketball star at school, and he replied to the professor's question by saying, I want the donut only if I can do my own push-ups. Dr. Christensen said, sorry, Steve has to do the push-ups. Well, then he said, I don't want the donut. Dr. Christensen turns to Steve and says, Steve, will you please do 10 push-ups so Scott can have a donut that he doesn't want? Scott said, hey, I didn't want it in the first place. And he said, look, Scott, this is my classroom. These are my desks. These are my donuts. Just leave it on the desk there if you don't want it. Okay? Put the donut on Scott's desk as Steve is doing his push-ups. He began to slow down a little bit, and some sweat began to form on his forehead, and Dr. Christensen then started down the third row. You could just feel the tone of the room changing. So he asked Jenny, Jenny, do you want a donut? Jenny said, no. And then Dr. Christensen said, Steve, will you please do 10 more push-ups so that Jenny can have a donut that she doesn't want? Steve did his 10, Jenny gets his donut. And by now, you can just feel the tension in the room. All the students were beginning to say no. There were uneaten donuts on each desk. Steve was putting forth a lot of effort to get 10 push-ups from every student who was seated in the class. And sweat was dripping from his forehead. His face was red, and you could see that his shirt was beginning to get soaked. Dr. Christensen comes to Robert, the most vocal unbeliever in the class, and he says, Robert, I want to make sure that Steve does all 10. Would you please watch him? By then, students from other classes were starting to come in, all sitting along the side of the room, just watching what was going on. When the professor saw them, he counted there were now 34 people in the room, and he was worried about Steve. Could he do that many push-ups? And Jason, who was a recent transfer student, didn't know what was going on, and he just came in to see. And the people from the class said, go away, don't come in. But Steve from the floor just looked up and he said, let him come in. And Jason was asked if he wanted a donut, and he said, sure. Steve, will you please do 10 push-ups so Jason now can have a donut? And he did 10 push-ups very slowly, and he struggled to get them all in. Jason just looked confused, but he was handed a donut. He sat down. Dr. Christensen then finished the 4th row of students, began on the other students who just came in. And Steve's arms were just shaking uncontrollably, as you can imagine, with each push-up. And by this time, sweat was pouring off of his head, and his face, and his arms. And he, as the doctor approached the last 2 students, Linda, would you like a donut? Linda was crying. She said, no, thank you. Steve, would you please do 10 more so Linda can have a donut that she doesn't want? Grunting from the effort, Steve did 10 very slow push-ups for Linda. Susan, would you like a donut? She was full of tears and didn't answer. Steve, will you please do your push-ups so Susan now can have a donut? And Susan asked the doctor, Dr. Christensen, why can't I help him? And by now, the professor had tears in his eyes. And he said, I have given him this task. And he is in charge of seeing that everybody has an opportunity for a donut, whether they want it or not. And he said, when I decided to have this party, I looked at the grade book, and I found that Steve was the only one with a perfect grade. And all of you had either failed a test or skipped class or turned in inferior work. And Steve told me when I was talking to him that in football, when a player messes up in practice, that he has to do push-ups. And so I told Steve that none of you can come to my party unless he paid the price by doing your push-ups. He and I made a deal for you. Steve did 350. With his arms buckling underneath him, 2 students had to help him up off the floor and into his seat. And although physically exhausted, he wore just a thin smile. The professor said, well done, good, faithful servant. You see, class, not all sermons preach with words. And turning to the students, he said, my wish for you is that you may fully comprehend the riches of grace and mercy that have been given to you through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. God did not spare his only Son, but gave him up for all of us. And whether we accept his gift or not is our choice. The price has been paid, so wouldn't you be foolish and ungrateful to leave it lying there on the desk? You know, sometimes life can be hard. It's when we need some encouragement. I think it's a good idea to look to the history makers and the heroes whose lives provide inspiration for us all. Would you pray with me? God, thank you for the life of Esther. Thank you, Lord, that you are so aware of our